I have an objection to the premise that for the $1 trillion deficit hole, because that assumes that we can't and won't cut spending in Washington, D.C. The only way that happens, in my humble opinion, is more conservative Republicans to be elected because they're on board with both cutting government and cutting taxes. If you elect Democrats, it will never happen.
Right. I saw a Republican congressman in the story a few minutes ago who noted that under this plan, it adds about $1 trillion to the national debt. I thought you guys were against that.
Yep, and we go through this every time, too. And the problem is the way that we gauge these things. And as an economist at the table here, I'll wade into it a little bit. But not using dynamic scoring with these sort of things makes no sense to me whatsoever. When you use a static model thinking that if you cut $1 trillion, that will not affect people's actions in any ways is just not living in the real world. So if it could be gauged with, well, all right, if you're cutting $1 trillion, that's keeping $1 trillion in the economy in a market-oriented way. That's going to generate more economic activity. That generates more tax revenue. So in that respect, I don't think that that's probably a good number. In fact, CBO has a pretty good track record of getting a lot of these wrong, and Obamacare wrong. It's just so hard when they're hemmed in by having to measure it in that sort of way.
We only have a few seconds left, but I want to give you a chance to respond to that.
If you look at the 60s through the 80s, we didn't have particularly strong economic growth. When you had that 2-year attempt to finally get dramatic tax reform, which this would be the most dramatic since then during the Reagan years, we had sustained growth, obviously with the ups and downs, but we had sustained economic growth at a much higher level, and I think it's hard to say that that had nothing to do with the dramatic tax cuts of the 80s.
Rod, make a point and then I have a question.
An objection to the premise that for the $1 trillion deficit hole, because that assumes that we can't and won't cut spending in Washington, D.C. That's probably a safe assumption in a political realm, but there's no reason why that should be the case. For the last 9 years or more, Americans have been living with tightened belts. A lot of middle-class Americans, a lot of Sarasotans have been living on less. And I think a lot of us get frustrated to think that there's no way, apparently, Washington can ever not always have more. Well, yeah, we're going to have deficits at some point if we try and do any tax cuts, if we won't cut spending.
Let me ask you this question, because I went through some of the things that will be going away, and that includes the deductions for student loan interest, tax prep expenses, moving expenses, unreimbursed employee expenses, and alimony. A lot of middle-class, working-class families have looked forward to those deductions to bump up their returns a little bit. What say you?
Well, I mean, okay, that's for those who do a full deduction, and obviously there's plenty of middle-class ones that don't do the full deductions, that take the standard deductions. But for those who use the full deductions and use those sorts of things, that would impact them. But that, as I understand it, is mitigated by other parts of the plan where you have tax cuts that favor those same families. So, you know, you have to take the package as a whole. If you take individual pieces, you're always going to have individual oxes gored. I mean, my gosh, I wouldn't want to be somebody making decent money owning a home in California under this plan, because you'll get crushed. You know, because you're getting rid of the income tax deduction.
Why don't we talk about the politics of this just for one moment? The three of you, raise your hands if you think this tax plan is going to pass as is.
No.
No.
Why?
Okay, it's the dynamics of the Senate. You have a 52-48 Republican. Susan Collins is a liberal, so nothing conservative. That makes it 51-49. You have Rand Paul, who's a conservative libertarian, who's a Puritan about it, which means if it's not pure enough, it won't pass him. That puts it at 50-50. That means the anti-Trump caucus, led by John McCain, can scuttle anything. I don't see any way it gets over 50.
What would you say to the vast audience of ours who are watching tonight and say, we want tax cuts, we want the government to stop spending so much money? Here we have an opportunity, and the three of you, Republican, Democrat, and the economists, are saying it's not going to happen right now.
It's not going to happen in this makeup. The only way that happens, in my humble opinion, is more conservative Republicans to be elected because they're on board with both cutting government and cutting taxes. If you elect Democrats, it will never happen.
There are huge political implications for the Republicans if nothing gets done, given the fact that we have not passed health care reform. Keith, so you know, what are Republicans like yourself on the Suncoast saying?
Well, the problem is the dynamics that I laid out there. Here's my frustration with it, is that most of the Republicans in both the Senate and the House have actually kept to their promises. But because the margins are so close, it only takes a few that have flipped. That means it looks like all Republicans won't keep their promises, and that's what it looks like. Right, I think you can potentially see 3 to 4% growth, but I think tax reform alone is not enough. I think that's one component. I think another component is deregulation, which some of that can be done in the executive branch.
Are you concerned that you know, you hear a lot of the predictions that the Republican Congress and this Republican president has to pass something.
Right. I mostly hear that out of the pundit class, which we're kind of in right here, and out of the media, and out of those who follow politics closely. I am not sure, I'm not convinced at all, that that's where your average American stands on these things, and the ones that vote, too. So, yes, as a political insider, it really, it worries me that we could get slammed for that, because historically that sort of happened. But I think we are in relatively unhistoric times with this president and this level of division, and I'm not sure that we get our fingers on the pulse of the American people at all like we think we might.
Okay, gentlemen.